Hello everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's video is back again with one of my favorite topics and triggers, talking about some of the books I've been reading recently. I actually looked back, and this is all of the books I've read in 2024. So I'm way off my usual pace. I've been in a little bit of a reading slump. So maybe we'll pick it up in the second half of the year. Maybe we won't. We'll see. But these are the books I've been reading, and I hope you enjoy hearing about them. So I will start with the book I am reading right now, which is called Chain Gang All-Stars. Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And this is, as you can see, I'm this far into it. I'm a little over halfway through, and I've been tearing through this book. I started it less than a week ago, probably 3 or 4 days ago, and have been reading it a lot. It is about a not so distant future in which criminals are able to win their freedom through a sort of melee death cage match. So somewhat reminiscent of, like Hunger Games or Battle Royale, which are both books I've really enjoyed, but a much more overt, not morality tale, but it actually reads very similar to Babel, which I read last year, because it also employs footnotes quite frequently to draw more overt parallels to things that have happened in the recent past and in real life, or things that are ongoing within the prison industrial system. The one thing that is very different from anything like Hunger Games or Babel, which it does kind of remind me of, is that it follows a lot of characters. It jumps between, I'm halfway through, and I think it's jumped between 5 or 6 POVs. So I do kind of wish that they spent more time on kind of the main plot, the A plot. It gives an interesting, it's very effective world building. It's very effective world building to see how this prison reform that publicizes and makes a huge profit off of this kind of sports entertainment deathmatch impacts lay people and protesters and people connected and employees and all of that. But it does mean that the main plot is not the focus. It focuses on a lot of different characters. But I will continue to read it, and I've really enjoyed it thus far. He has another book called Friday Black, which I'll probably seek out after this one, because I've really enjoyed it. Right before that, I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Evelyn Hugo. Evelyn Hugo. This book was not what I expected. I don't know. I expected that she had murdered her husbands, which is not the case. Spoiler, sorry. I don't know, I had heard surprisingly little about this book for how much I had heard it talked about. But let's just listen to the cover for a second. Says reclusive Hollywood icon Evelyn Hugo is finally ready to tell the truth about her glamorous and scandalous life. But when she chooses unknown magazine reporter Monique Grant to write her story, no one is more astounded than Monique herself. Determined to use this opportunity to jumpstart her career, Monique listens in fascination. From making her way to Los Angeles in the 1950s, to leaving show business in the 80s, and of course, the 7 husbands along the way, Evelyn unspools a tale of ruthless ambition, unexpected friendship, and a great forbidden love. But as Evelyn's story nears its conclusion, it becomes clear that her life intersects with Monique's own in tragic and irreversible ways. I got through this book pretty quickly. I probably read it in about a week, maybe a little less than a week. I thought it was entertaining. I wasn't blown away by it. I think it's obviously very much inspired by like Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and that era of old Hollywood. It also reminds me actually a good amount of, well, actually the prose, the style of writing reminds me a little bit of The Devil Wears Prada, which I actually read earlier this year, reread. I have a lot of thoughts on The Devil Wears Prada as a book versus movie adaptation that maybe I will make a whole video on at some point in time. And I love the movie, I really do. But they made some interesting changes when adapting the book to the movie that I don't necessarily agree with, and change a lot of character motivations. But anyway, the prose style I thought was pretty similar in The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, that kind of very casual gossip column. young, early 20s adult, like female. Although the authors are different, but it struck a couple similar chords just in the style of prose. I thought it was like, I was very much intrigued, like there were enough kind of like twists and turns I was very curious to know how the story was going to end. I thought that the final plot twist was a little bit like, okay, alright, okay, that's a choice. And at times, the writing, particularly the characters' dialogue, was just like a little too on the nose for my tastes. Like, particularly with when Evelyn and Monique are talking to each other in the present day, because a lot of the story is told in flashback. When talking in the present day, sometimes the dialogue is very like, and here's the point, and here's the message, and here's the moral. Just like super blatantly. And I thought it could have been worked in maybe a little bit more like smoother and realistically. But the plot was like very engaging, and it was a pretty fast read. So yeah. So yeah. Before the 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, the book I read immediately before that was The Miracle in the Andes. The Miracle in the Andes. 72 Days on the Mountain and My Long Trek Home by Nando Parado. If you're unfamiliar with The Miracle in the Andes, I won't say too much about it because it's not a very relaxing story, but I do think it's incredibly fascinating. And this is a memoir about the Miracle in the Andes, which is the true story of a plane crash that happened in the 1970s in the Andes Mountains bordering Chile and Argentina, when a plane with a Uruguayan rugby team crashed. And they had to go through like an insane survival ordeal. I've been really fascinated by this story and just like the lengths that these people went through, and particularly the public response that they dealt with after they came home, which I just can't imagine going through such a completely, I don't even know what to say. I can't imagine going through an ordeal like that and then having to continually talk about and speak about those experiences with an audience in the public who just could never understand the kinds of things you went through. But one of them wrote a book about it. Actually, several of them have written books. And there is a new book about it called The Society of the Snow. The Society of the Snow, which was also made into a movie, which I really enjoyed. That came out a couple weeks ago that I'm hoping my local library will have a copy of. But I've been really fascinated by this story. I actually started reading this while I was on a plane traveling, which was a terrible idea. Because that flight had a lot of turbulence actually. But I'm interested in hearing about the story from many different sides. This book was obviously written by Nando with the help of a autobiographer, I believe he's a journalist, Vince Rouse, who's kind of the, not necessarily ghostwriter, but contributed a lot to it, to the writing of it. And yeah, it's a crazy story. There's also a really good You're Wrong About podcast episode about it if you want to check it out. But yeah, Miracle in the Andes. This next book, or books, I've talked about previously, but I've actually finally gotten around to reading it, so now I can talk about it more in depth. And this is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings. And this is a volume that has all three: Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And I have finished the Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. And the reason I stopped reading after The Two Towers is because I was going on a trip and I just didn't want to put this in my carry-on bag to read it on the plane. So once I finished The Two Towers, I picked a shorter book to start reading because I did not want to. This thing is heavy. This is like 7 or 8 pounds, and I did not want to put it in my carry-on bag. But this is a super gorgeous color. Look at this. And I have seen the Lord of the Rings movies. I love the Lord of the Rings film score, but I had not actually read the books, and they've taken me a while to get through. I will be honest, the Fellowship of the Ring is not for me as a book. I found certain parts of it just took a long time for me to get through. I had a difficult time kind of getting invested in parts of what was happening. I enjoyed The Two Towers a lot more, and I'm excited for Return of the King, especially now that I've kind of taken a little bit of a break and I'm coming back to it. I feel like I'm ready to jump into it again, but marathoning all of them in a row sounded a little bit tiring. This is my husband's absolute favorite book series, that and Sherlock Holmes, and so that was a big motivation in me reading them, but I don't think it will be my favorite fantasy series, which feels completely treasonous to say. But I really enjoyed particularly Frodo and Sam's journey in The Two Towers, and I really have enjoyed that part of the story. I find book Aragorn not as compelling of a character as movie Aragorn, which I really hate saying. But I thought that was really a bummer because he's one of my favorite characters in the movie, and in the book he's just not doing it for me, which is a bummer. I'm so sorry. It feels very blasphemous to say that, and so I won't say it again. This is a gorgeous copy, and once I finish Chain Gang All-Stars, which will be probably in a couple of days, I'm gonna finish Return of the King and complete the trilogy. Earlier this year, I took the time to reread 1Q8 4 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami, and this is one of my favorite books. This is maybe my this was my third time rereading it. It's a chunker. But this is the book that introduced me to Murakami. And I was correct in remembering that the beginning third is really slow. It takes a minute to get started, but the plot really snowballs. So the beginning is a little clunky, like you gotta get through it. But once the plot takes off, it really takes off. And so the final 2/3 of this book just like steamroll, just like snowball into, like, I get so giddy waiting kind of for like the final bit to happen. Because it's set up in advance, so you kind of know what's coming and you're just like waiting to see how it's going to play out, like what's going to happen, so you just have this sense of anticipation to figure out when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And I found that really thrilling, particularly in my first read through. In rereading it, it's been probably 9 years since I've read this, if not longer, because I first read it in high school. So it's been at least 10 years since I read it. But I had forgotten actually a lot of the plot, so rereading it I was like, oh, I don't remember that happening, which made it much more rereadable, because so much of it relies on that anticipation that if you know exactly what's going to happen, I don't think that really diminishes the reading experience, particularly of this book. But because I had completely forgotten several major plot points, I got to experience that anticipation again. And Murakami's writing style is so surrealist, that kind of magical realism, and his writing style is very dreamlike, very fluid, very dreamlike, which I really enjoy reading. I find just the style of prose so lovely, but sometimes I actually do feel it makes retaining the plot of his novels a lot more difficult because it's so dreamlike. It feels like once you close it, you've like woken up from this dream and it's like slipping away. Or maybe I'm just bad at remembering the plots of books. Anyway, so yeah, I love this book. I love a lot of Murakami's books, but this one is one of my favorites. And then the last book is, I won't read the title out loud, but it's called BS Jobs. BS Jobs. This is a nonfiction book by David Graeber, who is a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. And I'd been interested in this book for a while. It's about essentially this kind of category of jobs that exist in many particularly highly developed countries with a lot of bureaucracy, and jobs that kind of exist but don't need to. I'm sure you can think of an example, a job where someone's task is to just like stamp papers or check boxes, where they're not really like, you could get rid of that job and the organization would continue to function just fine and society would continue to function just fine. And so I'd been really interested in this kind of like concept and learning more about like, why does this exist? Why is this a thing that happens? And this book did not satisfy some of the answers that I was looking for. Like many pop economics books, I think that this could have been a couple of essays. Like, it gets pretty redundant later on, and also he's not particularly faithful to his job's taxonomy. Like, he lays out in the first chapter several different kinds of BS jobs. You have the goons, the flunkies, the box stickers, duct tapers, and taskmasters. But he's not particularly faithful to that taxonomy and seems to redefine what it means to have a BS job depending on what's kind of like convenient for his thesis, which I find frustrating. I think it gave me a lot of interesting things to think about. And I wouldn't necessarily not recommend it. But it felt like he had several different topics that he had convinced himself was one topic, and I'm not necessarily convinced are all the exact same topic. However, I am not a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics, and he has obviously done much, much more research on this topic than I have. So I'm not saying he's wrong, I'm just saying I found some of his answers a little unsatisfying. But I do think it's an interesting topic to think about, kind of contemplate. And I'd had my eye on this book for a while, and getting a hold of it was really difficult because my library wouldn't stock it. So yeah. And then the last book I read this year, that I read in the very beginning of the year in January, was The Devil Wears Prada, which I have read before, and I probably will read again. But yeah, I've been in a little bit of a reading slump. I usually read like around 20 to 30 books a year. I'm now on like 6 or 7, and it's halfway through the year, so we'll see what happens. That's okay. We're taking it easy. I'm enjoying just kind of reading books I like and finding stories that speak to me and interest me and make me think. And so I'm trying to not press myself about the quantity or the time spent reading, because I have a pretty good reading habit. It's part of my routine. But if you have book suggestions, I would love to hear them in the comments. If you have summer reading that you're doing and you have anything that you've really enjoyed or has really made you think, really made you get deeper into a topic, leave it in the comments and maybe I'll check it out. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video, and good night. Good night. Good night.